They walked out in silence after being denied a table, but the next morning they owned the restaurant. There's a certain kind of excitement that builds when you're planning a night out, a special occasion, a little break from the routine. It's even more special when it's for a milestone. For Alan and Denise, this was supposed to be their night. They had saved up, scouted online reviews, and picked a place that promised fine dining and a chance to treat themselves. Claiborne's Bistro, a high-end restaurant in the heart of Santa Monica. They didn't fit the image of the restaurant's typical clientele. Alan, a local community organizer, and Denise, a teacher, weren't about flashy appearances. They walked in holding hands, their outfits simple but thoughtfully chosen. The host's stand gleamed under the chandelier lights, and the air smelled of fresh baked bread and rosemary. Their smiles were warm and expectant, but as they approached the front, the atmosphere shifted. The man behind the podium, tall with a stiff posture and a forced smile, glanced at them briefly before lowering his gaze to the reservation book. "Do you have a reservation?" he asked, his tone flat. Denise nodded. "We called earlier this week under Denise Foster." The man's fingers skimmed the pages, a process that took longer than it should have. He finally looked up, his expression tight. "I'm sorry, but we're completely booked tonight. There's nothing available." Alan glanced over his shoulder. The dining room was dotted with empty tables, candlelight flickering from several unused place settings. His eyes narrowed, but Denise gave his arm a light squeeze, her silent way of saying, "Let it go for now." They stepped aside, a mixture of confusion and disappointment painting their faces. But the night wasn't over. What happened next would change everything for them, for the restaurant, and for the manager who thought he could make assumptions based on appearances. But no one at the bistro could have anticipated what the next 24 hours would bring. Alan and Denise had been looking forward to this evening for weeks. It wasn't just any dinner. It marked their 10th wedding anniversary. They didn't have the kind of lifestyle that allowed for frequent fine dining, but this night was meant to be an exception. Denise had even convinced Alan to wear a tie, despite his complaints about it choking him. The drive to Claiborne's Bistro felt like a small adventure. Denise had spent time reading about the restaurant's renowned chef, famous for blending French cuisine with California flavors. The reviews spoke of impeccable service, a romantic ambience, and dishes that were as beautiful as they were delicious. For Denise, a quiet romantic evening at a place like this was a dream. Alan, ever the practical one, had his doubts. What if it's all hype? He teased as they parked in the crowded lot. Denise shot him a playful glare. "You're always suspicious of nice things. Just trust me tonight." They stepped inside, and for a moment, Denise felt like she'd been transported to another world. The soft hum of conversation, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the aroma of truffle butter and fresh herbs created an atmosphere that felt magical. Large windows framed the glow of the city outside, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Alan leaned in and whispered, "Okay, this is nice. You win." Denise smiled. For a second, she let herself believe the night would be perfect. When they reached the host stand, Denise offered their name, her voice laced with excitement. But the moment she said it, she noticed something. The man's polite smile faltered just briefly, but enough for her to catch it. His eyes darted between them, and the change in his demeanor was subtle but clear as he fumbled through the reservation book. Denise's stomach tightened. Something felt off. Alan had noticed it too. She could tell by the way his posture shifted slightly, as if preparing for something unpleasant. When the man finally looked up and announced there was no availability, Denise's heart sank. "But we called and confirmed last week," she said gently, though her voice quivered just slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he replied, his tone clipped. "We've had some last-minute reservations come in, and we simply can't accommodate you." Denise glanced past him again. The dining room was far from packed. There were tables open, at least 4 of them. She met Alan's gaze, searching for an answer to the question they both silently asked. "Why us?" But instead of pressing the issue, Denise simply whispered, "Let's go." not knowing that this moment would ignite something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. As Alan and Denise walked out into the cool night air, the weight of the moment settled over them. Alan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he replayed the interaction in his mind. "Did you see those empty tables?" he finally said, his voice low but laced with frustration. Denise nodded, but her gaze stayed fixed on the sidewalk ahead. She hated confrontation, especially on a night that was supposed to be about joy. "I saw," she said softly, almost as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile sense of composure she was clinging to. They walked to their car in silence, each lost in their thoughts. For Alan, the injustice burned hot. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but that didn't make it any easier. Denise, on the other hand, felt a mix of anger and sadness. She had wanted so badly for this night to be special, for it to be about them and their love, not another reminder of the way the world could treat people like them. Alan finally broke the silence as they reached the car. "We should have said something," he muttered, gripping the door handle tightly. "And what would that have done?" Denise replied, her voice tinged with weariness. "It wouldn't have changed his mind." Alan exhaled sharply and leaned against the car. He looked back at the restaurant, its golden lights shining warmly in the distance, a stark contrast to how cold the manager's words had felt. "It's not right," he said. Denise stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I know it's not, but we don't have to let him ruin tonight. Let's just go somewhere else, okay?" But Alan couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just one bad experience. It wasn't about the food or the fancy decor. It was about being treated like they didn't belong. Still, he nodded, not wanting to upset Denise further. They got in the car and drove off, leaving Claiborne's bistro behind them. Neither of them knew that fate had already started to turn the wheel. The next chapter of this story wasn't about them leaving in defeat. It was about what they would do next. Sometimes life gives you a moment of clarity, a chance to rewrite the story in a way no one sees coming. That night, as Alan and Denise sat in a quiet diner sharing a slice of pecan pie, something shifted. Alan couldn't stop thinking about the manager's dismissive tone, the way his eyes had skimmed over them like they didn't matter. Denise, meanwhile, was replaying the entire evening in her head, from the excitement they'd felt walking in to the sting of walking out. "What if we're wrong?" Denise asked suddenly, her fork hovering midair. Alan raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About letting it go," she replied. "What if we're supposed to do something about it?" Alan set his coffee cup down, intrigued by the determination in her voice. "Go on." Denise leaned in, her eyes narrowing slightly as the idea took shape in her mind. "You remember the papers we signed last week? The restaurant group's acquisition deal?" Alan nodded slowly. It had been a whirlwind process, an unexpected opportunity to invest in a portfolio of businesses, including a few restaurants, one of which happened to be Claiborne's Bistro. At the time, it had felt like a distant venture, something handled by lawyers and executives. But now, it suddenly felt personal. "What if we don't just own a piece of it?" Denise continued. "What if we own it? What if we show up tomorrow and remind them who really calls the shots?" Alan's lips curved into a slow smile. He could see the fire in Denise's eyes, a spark he hadn't seen in a while. "You're serious," he said, more a statement than a question. "I am," Denise replied, her voice steady. "They treated us like we didn't belong, Alan. But the truth is, we belong there more than they know." The conversation lit a fuse. By the time they left the diner, the plan was set. They would return to Claiborne's Bistro, not as guests seeking a table, but as the rightful owners of the very place that had turned them away. That night they barely slept. Emails were sent, calls were made, and by morning they were ready. Denise chose a bright blazer that radiated confidence, while Alan decided on his favorite tailored suit. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about walking in with the assurance they'd been denied the night before. As they drove back to Claiborne's Bistro, the tables were already starting to turn. The late morning sun cast long shadows on the pavement as Alan and Denise pulled into the parking lot of Claiborne's Bistro. This time, their steps were deliberate, their heads held high. The same air of sophistication that had been dismissed the night before now carried a quiet authority. Inside, the restaurant was bustling with its usual lunch preparations. The staff flitted about setting tables and arranging floral centerpieces, unaware of the shift about to unfold. Behind the host's stand stood the same manager. His name tag read Elliot, and his demeanor was just as rigid as the night before. When Alan and Denise entered, he barely looked up, assuming they were another set of customers to brush aside. "Can I help you?" Elliot asked, his tone bordering on dismissive. Denise smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Actually, we're here to meet with the team. Is the chef available?" Elliot's brow furrowed in confusion. "The team? I wasn't informed of any meeting." Alan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You wouldn't have been, but you'll want to gather everyone now. It concerns the future of this restaurant." Elliot hesitated, his eyes darting between them. There was something in their tone, a quiet confidence that made him uneasy. Reluctantly, he motioned for a nearby server to fetch the chef. Within minutes, the small team of staff, chefs, servers, and a handful of kitchen workers assembled near the dining area. Elliot stood off to the side, arms crossed, clearly irritated by the interruption. Alan cleared his throat, and the room quieted. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Foster, and this is my wife, Denise. You may not know us yet, but we've been involved with this restaurant for a little while now. Yesterday, we decided it was time to pay a visit." Elliot's eyes narrowed, confusion giving way to realization. "Wait, what are you saying?" Denise stepped forward, her voice steady. "We're the new owners of Claiborne's Bistro. As of last week, this restaurant became part of our portfolio, and as of today, we'll be taking a more hands-on role in its operations." A ripple of surprise spread through the room. The staff exchanged glances, while Elliot's face turned pale. "There must be some mistake," he stammered. "No one told me." "There's no mistake," Alan interrupted. "And we'll address that shortly. But for now, we want to assure everyone that our goal is to make this place the best it can be for the staff, the customers, and the community." Denise turned her attention to the staff. "We've seen the reviews, the reputation this restaurant has built, and the hard work you've all put in. But we've also seen areas that need change. One of those changes involves how we treat people, our customers and each other." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elliot shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. But the real reckoning hadn't even started yet. That would come when Elliot was called into the office, face to face with the consequences of his actions. Once the staff dispersed, Alan and Denise asked Elliot to join them in the manager's office. The room, though neatly arranged, suddenly felt stifling under the weight of what was about to be discussed. Alan sat behind the desk while Denise stood beside him, her arms crossed but her expression calm. Elliot walked in with forced composure, but his uneasiness was clear. He hesitated before sitting across from them, his hands fidgeting on his lap. "If this is about the meeting earlier, I wasn't informed," he said. Denise cut him off with a sharp but polite tone. "This isn't about communication errors, Elliot. This is about yesterday." Elliot froze, his expression carefully blank. "Yesterday?" Alan leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "You remember us, don't you? The couple you turned away, claiming the restaurant was fully booked." Elliot's eyes darted downward, and a bead of sweat formed on his temple. I don't recall exactly. We had a busy evening." "Don't do that," Denise interrupted, her voice firm but not raised. "Don't pretend you don't know what we're talking about. You looked us in the eye and dismissed us like we didn't matter, like we didn't belong." Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Alan continued, his tone measured but powerful. "We gave you the benefit of the doubt. We thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, but when we looked around, we saw the empty tables, the way you avoided meeting our gaze, and we knew exactly what it was." Elliot's face turned red, his discomfort palpable. I didn't mean any harm, he finally muttered. It wasn't personal. Denise raised an eyebrow. Not personal. That's easy to say when you're the one handing out the humiliation. The room went silent for a moment, the tension thick. Alan leaned back, studying the man in front of him. Here's the thing, Elliot. You were wrong on so many levels, and we're not here to humiliate you or make you grovel. But this restaurant can't succeed under leadership that treats people unfairly. Not our staff, not our customers. Denise softened slightly, her voice taking on a more reflective tone. We believe in giving people second chances when they show they're willing to change. So the question is, are you willing to own up to what you did and commit to being better? Elliot sat there, visibly grappling with his pride and the gravity of the situation. After what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly. Yes, I understand. Hey, I'm sorry. Alan nodded, though his expression remained serious. Apologies are a start, but actions will show us whether you mean it. We'll be keeping a close eye on how things operate moving forward. If you can't rise to the occasion, we'll find someone who can. Elliot swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Understood. The meeting ended, but the real work was just beginning. What Elliot did next would determine whether he had truly learned his lesson, or if his chapter at Claiborne's would soon come to an end. In the days and weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Claiborne's bistro began to shift. Alan and Denise visited frequently, not to micromanage, but to observe, to listen, and to set an example of leadership grounded in respect and fairness. They knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were committed to building a space where everyone felt welcome, no matter who they were or how they looked. Elliot, to his credit, took their words to heart. He started treating both the staff and patrons with more kindness and professionalism. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when old habits crept in, but Denise believed in giving people the chance to grow. Sometimes, she told Alan one evening, people just need to see things from a different perspective. The community noticed the changes too. Regulars who had heard whispers of the restaurant's unwelcoming reputation were surprised by the warmth they now encountered. New customers began to pour in, drawn not just by the food, but by the energy of a place that had transformed into something more inclusive. Alan and Denise never announced publicly what had happened that night. They didn't seek revenge or public sympathy. For them, the greatest victory was reclaiming their dignity and showing that success wasn't just about climbing to the top, it was about lifting others up along the way. As for Elliot, he became a quiet example of redemption. He never apologized again after that day in the office, but his actions spoke louder than words. When a young couple walked into the restaurant one busy Friday evening, nervous, modestly dressed, and clearly out of place, he greeted them with a genuine smile and made sure they were seated at one of the best tables in the house. For Alan and Denise, that moment was worth more than any confrontation or public call-out could ever achieve. It wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about creating a ripple effect of kindness, respect, and understanding. As Denise looked around the dining room one night, watching the hum of activity and the happy faces at each table, she turned to Alan and smiled. "This is what I imagined when I picked this place," she said softly. Alan nodded, a quiet pride in his expression. "It's better than what we imagined because we made it ours." Sometimes the best way to fight back isn't with anger, but with purpose. And sometimes the tables really do turn in ways you'd never expect. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and uplift.